One reason for this, I think, was a religious faith, which became deeper for both of these men as they aged. But that faith resided in the city of God, not the city of man. Hence, that faith's minimal expectations for what beyond bearing witness could be accomplished in this life. Both men doubted profoundly the capacity of their naive, gullible country, the United States, to survive in a sinister world. Both were, at the same time, and in their own way, deeply dedicated American patriots whose own lonely acts of witness illuminated the country's path to survival through this horrible century. Their despair, however, was so deep that both not only contemplated suicide, but actually took steps to make it possible. As Chambers describes it in Witness, it was the day he went to a garden store in Lower Manhattan and picked up bug killer, which actually was cyanide-based, and took it home and opened the can and tried to mix it with the right amount of water and throw a towel over his head and breathe the fumes and hope to wake up, not waking up. But he was saved by his own short-sightedness. He could not read the instructions on the can, and so got the proportions wrong. For Kennan, it was during his brief, bleak ambassadorship in Moscow in 1952, when the situation was so grim, that Kennan insisted that the CIA equip him with suicide pills, lest in the event of war he be interned, as he had been in Nazi Germany in 1942, but he feared torture. And so that was what the purpose of the suicide pills were in his case. He didn't use them. He told me he flushed them down the toilet eventually. But that he ordered them, I think, is deeply significant. Both men in later life preoccupied themselves, and indeed overwhelmed anybody who would read them or listen to them, with great fears, and I mean great fears in capital letters. Chambers, that the New Deal and all that followed from it was part of some kind of gigantic communist conspiracy. Kennan, that nuclear weapons could not be developed and deployed without placing at risk the fate of the earth. Both, significantly, I think, were farmers. Chambers in Maryland, Kennan in Pennsylvania, finding in the physical labor associated with that profession at least the limited refuge that made life, and especially family life, possible. And finally, both were great writers. Even if their writing is repetitious, that prose, their prose, has kept their ideas compelling against time and space. And as Ronald Reagan was suggesting, it will do that in the future, which is to say that each man produced classical works that will be read as far as we can see into the future, one of which, of course, we celebrate here today. Now, in his review in the New Criterion, Jim Pearson, who I think, is Jim here yet? He's on the way, I guess. Jim Pearson summed up Kennan in a single sentence, an accomplishment which I never came close to achieving in my book. Kennan was, Jim wrote, quote, an independent thinker of the first order who at a critical moment in history saw something clearly that others saw but through a haze, and by an act of singular intellectual courage earned absolution for any misjudgments he may have subsequently committed. I hope Jim would not mind if I change only 2 words in that quote to let it sum up Whittaker Chambers, who through an act of singular moral courage earned absolution for any misjudgments he may previously have committed. Thanks for your attention.
First of all, it is a great pleasure to be back in Lindsley Chit. I had many a class in this building, and I'm pleased to say it's exactly the same as it was 60 years ago. Some things do not change. Further touch of nostalgia, I was a freshman here when God and Man at Yale came out. I read it at the time. Everyone was in a complete uproar against it, although no one had read it. true, I did read it and said, this is exactly what is going on here. And so that was my introduction to Bill Buckley, whom I then met when I was still an undergraduate. And he was a friend of mine for, those many years until he passed away recently. And the last time I took the train up from Washington to Connecticut, it was to see Bill at Stanford some years ago. But I used to take it all the time to come back and forth. We lived outside Washington at that time to New Haven. And I always enjoyed riding the train. Lee and I talked about this earlier. The only problem was you had to go through New York. And I'm always reminded of the little girl who was trying to say the Lord's Prayer and got confused and said, "Lead us not into Penn Station." And truer words were never spoken. Well, it's a little better now than it used to be. But anyway, I read Witness. I did read Witness shortly after it came out. It came out when I was a sophomore, 1952. I didn't read it at the time, but I subsequently read it. I've read and reread it many times since. It is a book that rewards careful study. And I have approached it, and this is a new book that I co-authored. It just came out, in which Chambers emerges as sort of the central character, which was not my intention when I began. But the more I looked into matters, the more I realized that Chambers was a critical figure in almost too many senses to list. His book is, among other things, apart from its literary merits and his tremendous gift of language, is a history of the domestic Cold War, one of the best. It is not only a history, it is a source. He was himself a primary source, and all of us who work in this vineyard know you have to go to the primary sources. It's very risky to rely on secondary sources. He was himself a primary source. And I would say he was also, his book is a guide for the perplexed. There are benchmarks of judgment there that stand us in good stead to this day, in addition to the information that he provides. As I delved into some of these things myself, using some primary sources, mostly FBI files, I realized the centrality of Chambers to the whole domestic Cold War story, not only in his case, but in other ways. And the more I learned about his travail and his service and his sacrifice, and the more I learned through him about the nature of the internal problem in our security situation in the 1930s and particularly in the 1940s, although he gave most of his testimony about the 30s, he was still around in the 40s, as you know. And he was consulted often by the FBI in the 40s. I realized that I formulated what I call about that problem Evans' law of inadequate paranoia, which says that no matter how bad you think something is, when you look into it, it's always worse. And that was certainly the case with the penetration of our government by agents of the Soviet Union, members of the Communist Party, fellow travelers, on all of which fronts Chambers was most instructive. And he made these points that have been confirmed repeatedly by the new information. One was the extent, this has been alluded to by the previous speakers, of the penetration. It was formidable. It was not only formidable in terms of numbers, but in the level of penetration. There were many, many of these agents and many, many posts of power. Alger Hiss was but one of those. He was not alone. Another was Harry Dexter White, Treasury Department. Another was Lachlan Curry in the White House. These were three top Soviet agents at very high levels in our government. The second point, well, let me just follow that up a little bit. All of that he told us, that he intimates in Witness, is confirmed over and over again by the records from the Soviet Union, the Venona decryptions, which were secret messages sent back and forth between the Moscow bosses and their agents over here, which The code was broken by our cryptologists back in the 40s. There were other records from the Soviet Union, the Vasiliev papers, which have recently come forth, who was a defecting KGB agent who names many of the suspects that he knew about from KGB records in Moscow. And most of all, the FBI files, of which there are hundreds of thousands of pages on these cases, on Hiss, on White, on Lachlan Curry, and a bevy of other of these suspects who were in the government, got there in the 30s and 40s, particularly during the war, when the Soviets were our allies. All of this over and over again confirms everything Chambers had to say, and indeed goes beyond what Chambers had to say, because he did not know everything the FBI knew. The FBI knew what he knew, but he didn't know what the FBI knew. The second major point that spins off of that was Chambers' assertion, which this book is about, that the real issue was not espionage. It wasn't spying. Well, that's what all the movies are about, and that's where all the cloak and dagger images are. It was policy influence. What these people were doing, in some cases with greater success than others, but often with very great success, was to tilt American policy in the Cold War in favor of the Soviet interest. And he made that point very strongly in Witness, and it's been confirmed by everything that I've seen in my recent studies. This book contains case histories, case studies of the run-up to Pearl Harbor, what happened in China, what happened in Yugoslavia, what happened in Poland, the so-called Morgenthau Plan for turning Germany into a cow pasture, the approval of slave labor as reparations to Moscow, approved at Yalta, the Yalta Conference, where Hiss was a major factor, Operation Keel Haul, which turned 2 million anti-Soviet refugees back over to the Soviets, also agreed to at Yalta. Those are examples, and then there are others I know not of, but those are the ones I do know of, in which pro-Soviet operatives within our government tilted policy in favor of the communist interest. Final point that Chambers makes over and over again in Witness, and is confirmed by everything else that I've seen since, which contributed to he had a very morose temperament. He was very pessimistic, and with good reason. He knew a lot, and he couldn't get other people to believe it. He was a Cassandra, and he, as Professor Gaddis has pointed out, had made revelations about these problems, not in the 40s, but in 1939, to Adolph Burley, then Assistant Secretary of State. Nothing was done. He named Hiss then, in 1939. That was ignored at the time, in the war, in the pro-Soviet atmosphere. No one wanted to hear such things. He then ran into greater efforts at concealment and misrepresentation when the case surfaced in almost a decade later, in 1948. And this made him extremely pessimistic. And there's a kind of a pervasive sense of doom in the final chapters of Witness, which was personal. The suicide attempt has been mentioned, fortunately did not succeed, but also societal. He thought we were doomed. He thought the free world was doomed. And one of the reasons he thought that was he believed that there were people in the government who knew very well what was going on and would do nothing about it. And he was right in this respect. How right is hard to gauge, but he himself was in considerable peril when he made the revelations he did. He went before the House Committee in August of 1948, testified in public against Hiss and others, things that he had said in private long before the FBI. The FBI knew this in 1945 at the latest. Everything that Chambers said in 48, the FBI knew in 1945. And we have those records that show that.